Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. A short disclaimer about today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. I'll now take a moment to introduce today's presenters. Today we have with us Kay Shattuck, Doctor of Education, who's been involved with Quality Matters since its inception and as the Director of Research provides direction for the organization's research efforts. She is the editor-author of Assuring Quality in Online Education, Practices and Processes at Teaching, Resource, and Program Levels. Her academic affiliation is Penn State University's Education/Learning Performance Systems. She has taught online with Penn State's World Campus since 2000. We also have with us Christine Volker, who is the K-12 Program Director for Quality Matters. She has been involved with K-12 education for nearly 20 years, with an emphasis on distance learning, library media, instructional technology, and professional development. Prior to coming to Quality Matters, Christine was an educational technology teacher specialist. As such, she developed and coordinated the first student online learning program for the district. She holds an advanced certificate in administration and supervision, a master's in library and information sciences, and a BA in both history and social sciences interdisciplinary, early childhood education. With that, I will hand it over to Kay to start us off.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be with you on this beautifully snowy day, at least on the Pennsylvania-Maryland line. We didn't get much snow, so I hope that's the same for you. I know that wherever you are, the chances are you have some snow unless you happen to be on the West Coast. If you've been following the chat box, you'll see that Christine's having some technical issues, and so I am going to be the key presenter. If Christine can hop back in here, that will be great. She will be able to, as far as I can see, she'll be able to help us in the chat box. As we were introduced, we have both been involved with Quality Matters for quite a while, and online learning even longer. We really welcome this opportunity to talk today about research. One of the things that Quality Matters is really hinged in is the application of research, design-based research. It can be called in the field. But we have since the very beginning been focused on following what's happening in the research. But you know, research is one of those really challenging words that is, from my perspective, sometimes overused to describe anything. I mean, if I'm going to make a trip to sunny California, I'm going to research it by going online and looking at tourist information. So what we want to sort of put our hands around today is that there's a continuum of the use of the word research. It can be overused, but there really is scholarly research. As you all know, you're educators, and that research has some well-established protocols. But for us, as educators, we're interested in research. It still has a continuum. We can be interested in researching our own courses, and as self-reflective practitioners, that's one of the basis of our continuing to improve our own skills, our own knowledge, as well as applications for our learners. So we research our own courses. Sometimes it's informal, sometimes it's formal. We also seek best practice examples and descriptive case studies that can be used to develop broader procedures and policies well beyond my single course. And then another level of research, and this is the one we will talk about most today, is gathering and analyzing evidence of effectiveness. And these are the kinds of studies that you will remember from your last methodology course, research methodology course. These are studies that it's tempting, but we don't generalize. These studies provide evidence, and then if there's a body of evidence that seems to promote a certain effectiveness of a group of variables, then we can move that into application. That's what we really are going to talk about and try to do. At Quality Matters, we have Quality Matters, as you might know, has its origins in higher education, and that's the primary, that continues to be the largest portion of the subscribers. However, K-12 has been certainly on our minds, and we're very involved in it now for a number of years, and Chris Volker is leading those efforts. However, we have to say, and this is not just my impression, folks like Kavanaugh, Barber, Clark, and Gear have said for a number of years, in looking at the K-12 research literature, it's inescapable that it's based on adult learner higher education research. And you know, if you sit back, that makes sense, because that's who was doing the research in online education actually decades ago. The K-12 research literature, after it's been looked at as a body of literature, has been in the past primarily focused on looking at what are the benefits and what are the challenges of online education. And it has been also focused on comparing and generalizing face-to-face and online learning. And those of us who followed higher education research in online learning and distance learning know that that's to be expected. The first decade or so in higher education, it was just that, comparing and generalizing from face-to-face to online. And there's a whole body of research out there called No Significant Difference that documents studies in higher education primarily that that both formats can and do result in quality instruction and learning. One of the things that we know and is pointed out actually from someone looking at K-12 in his or her dissertation, Belderin, and we have we will give you these references at the end, noted, that simplistic look at all face-to-face and all online courses is fraught with some methodological challenges. But that's what the literature, the research literature in K-12 has really hinged on. Inescapable, it's based on adult learning and higher education research, because that's the only research that was out there. Basically, that was the primary body of research that was there, looking at global benefits challenges and comparing it to face-to-face. But when we review the literature, as we do, it was also inescapable that there are some emerging themes in the K-12 literature, and this is what makes it really exciting. And we're going to talk about those because they're really moving now into research themes that are clearly more focused on pedagogical issues. When we work at Quality Matters, when we prepare to set standards that turn into a rubric, we do a survey of the literature, the research literature, to see what's happening. So we're most excited that these things are really surfacing in the literature, so that we don't have to make these big generalizations from higher education to K-12. However, and this is always my caveat, we do it, it comes naturally, not we not being K-12, but us as educators. I mean, Chickering and Gamson in '87, their work, I think, is pretty well recognized as a seminal piece from K-12 to way up to through higher education. Chickering and Gamson was a review of research on traditional undergrad learners in the classroom. So the temptation and the realities of this cross-fertilization are with us. So there are some emerging themes in K-12 that we want to look at, and some new directions, and still acknowledge that there is cross-fertilization from K-12 and higher ed. This is a Chris slide, so I'm going to talk now about learner focusedness. The shift can be seen in the research, where it's not just looking at at-risk students. We want to look at interactions and really focus on the individual student. In previous times, early times in K-12 research, as was higher ed, the focus was on describing those people who came into online learning. And some of the assumptions behind that is, if they don't fit the mold, then they shouldn't be here. The shift that can be seen in the K-12 as well as higher education research is, they're here. They are here. We need to individualize and meet their needs. We're not plugging only deserving students into our classes. They're all here. There certainly are a growing number of at-risk students who are coming into online learning, and at-risk and credit recovery students. We need to make sure that we don't, in our great search for universal simple answers, only rely on studies and designing for courses for higher ability students. So we will continue, hopefully over the next years in research, see more emphasis on what we can do to personalize education, whether it's for an at-risk student or a student of high ability. One of the other themes that is emerging from the literature, it's inescapable when you read the literature, is a growing focus on research about learner interaction and engagement. And that's in K-12, and that's clearly in higher education. I'm just reading my notes here because I think this was a Chris slide, just making sure I cover everything. But let me move to the next slide. One of the things that is seen in the K-12 literature in the past few years is growing recognition and use of the community of inquiry framework. And that is, it was based in higher education, but it's a useful framework for the study of online learning. And what the community of inquiry framework says, there are, and I'll put the, maybe if Chris can hear me, maybe Chris could put in the chat box a link to community of inquiry framework. If not, I will do that in a few minutes. The framework suggests that for student learning to happen, for student engagement to happen, there are 3 buckets of presence. And presence has been in the distance ed and online learning literature now for several decades. And presence is simply the connection that one feels, the user feels, with what's happening on the web page, on the screen. Am I truly engaged in that? I mean, if we think about engagement with a screen, think of anybody gaming. I mean, that's clearly presence. Somebody's into it. They're very engaged. Thank you, Barbara. So there are 3. The community inquiry framework says when we design and when we study, which is what we're talking about now, when we study the effectiveness of online learning, if we break down and look at social presence, that has to do with how real I as a student feel. Do I feel like I'm really engaged with the content, with the instructor? Am I really fully there? Does anybody know I'm here, so to speak? Teaching presence, not teacher, but teaching presence. Teaching presence includes, and you can explore this further, teaching presence includes the design and management and facilitation of a course. So the instructor is involved in the facilitation, but for our Quality Matters hearts, it also has to do with the design of a course. So if I'm a student, feel really engaged and connecting with the content, what's on the screen, with what's happening in the course. If those things are happening, cognitive presence, which is where the learning is, the tool of learning takes place, the space of learning takes place. So again, this is not a session on community of inquiry, just to say that the exciting thing is that we can see that framework being used within the K-12 research literature. Also being noted in the K-12 literature sort of bubbling up is the importance is a value term, but the effectiveness of professional development. I found this really interesting study just I think last week, that in fact the Gates Foundation last year provided funds to study teachers' viewpoints on professional development. This is K-12. And the whole report is listed at the end. Yes, I see Chris might want to talk in a second, so let me finish this slide, and Chris, then you can jump in and let them know what I've forgotten. But this K-12 study on teachers' viewpoints provided some evidence that the teachers in the study found that there was a disconnect between the intent of the professional development and the experience of the teachers. It also found that from the teacher's perspective, there were types of offerings, and one was compliance sessions, and those those outnumbered the sessions for planning, designing, and delivering instruction. As a part of this study, in summarizing this study, what was found from this survey there were some characteristics of professional development that were associated with improving student achievement. And those included, and you know, I'm preaching to the choir, right? Those included teacher learning goals that are aligned with standards. People wanted to see there's some evidence for their work. I'm going to let Chris take the mic now if you want, and catch people up with what I've missed.
Well, I don't know. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can. I can hear all of you whooping and hollering and saying, "Yay, Chris is here!" I'm really, really sorry about all of that. But I just want to thank everybody for having me here today. And Kay for wonderfully stepping in. Well, I think it was wonderful. I couldn't hear, so I don't really know, but I'm gonna say that it was. But thank you guys so much, and thank you for coming to this webinar. I'll go back to what Kay was just before she started talking about that disconnect with professional development. What we found really through all the research was that naturally we need to teach pre-service teachers how to work with at-risk students, and I'm sure Kay talked all about that earlier on. We need to figure out how to give them the skills to make their courses more learner-focused so that those at-risk students don't fall through the cracks and then turn into the dropouts. We need to give the teachers the skills to build more interactivity into their courses, and how can we help them build that presence within the online classroom and design courses that are bubbling over with opportunities for active learning. At Quality Matters, we offer courses that help empower teachers to design well-crafted and aligned online courses, but there are other opportunities to incorporate this into pre-service field experiences, matching these new and aspiring teachers up with master teachers in the field, those teachers who are trained in how to really mentor these teachers. And I know those of you who are here today know a lot on that topic. We need to give them opportunities to practice these approaches in an actual setting. So I'll go back, I'll let Kay finish up now where she was, and I don't know how we got all the way back to a shift. I'm going to let go of the mic.
That was me shifting back. I'm just wondering if there are any questions at this point, anything that you just can hardly wait to ask. I don't see any questions. Chris and I represent, at least in this presentation, the two sides of what we do. I try to review the research, document the research, analyze it, and make some statements about what evidence is provided. And then Chris and her crew take that information and turn it into ways that can be applied as Chris just mentioned, in pre-service, in-service, ways that we can take what is being learned from research and apply it. And of course, we'll swing back, because then we want to study what we've applied. But that's the end of the cycle, where we begin again. But no questions? Do I have no questions? Okay, so one of the other, I mean, if you have a question, put it in the chat box and we will quickly respond to it. One of the things that is another theme that's bubbling up in the most recent K-12 research that we surveyed was the need for quality assurance, to look at quality assurance, which is, of course, the broader piece of education. And quality assurance pulls together these pieces, as I attempted to explain in the very beginning. The K-12 as higher ed research began with, I want to study my own course, which is never a bad thing, but it only stayed in that. Looked at best practices, and sometimes best practices means it works for me, therefore it should be good. But there certainly are some strategies for defining what is the best practice, and the research can do that. Looking at interaction, and then quality assurance pulls it together, and as a cognitive scientist just in a very recent book, I think it's called, I have it right here, Minds Online, Teaching Effectively with Technology, Michelle Miller wrote, it makes sense to conclude that quality online learning experiences are possible. There's evidence of that. And to turn back our attention to maximizing that quality. And our involvement, my involvement with Quality Matters, and even with any of the online education ventures that I'm involved in, and there are many people like me that say we need to maximize quality, and we can do that by connecting the dots of what we hear from research. Let me read Joe. Joe, would you want to repeat your question, and then I'll give me a second to think of an answer?
I can address this question. Okay. So Joe's wondering if there are any common themes that have come out of our K-12 reviews. For instance, what are some areas of reviews that are revealing the strengths of most courses, and what are the reviews generally suggesting to be areas that tend to lack desired quality? In terms of lacking desired quality, we're finding a lot of the need to really shore up those learning objectives. And what we're finding is that a lot of times those learning objectives aren't there, or they really, really need to be measurable. And so they're not measurable, and so we're having a lot of times we're having to go back and halting the whole review because those learning objectives aren't there. And so that's one of the things that we're finding to be something that is somewhat of a struggle, and we do require, you know, that those learning objectives are there in the course at the course level and also at the unit level.
And learning objectives, wearing my higher education hat, I'm always amazed. K-12 teachers usually know how to write learning objectives because in pre-service, that's one of the things that you work on. That's not the case for higher education. Higher education faculty sometimes are challenged by the need to write learning objectives. So certainly there are some issues, as Chris pointed out, but writing learning objectives seems to come a little bit more second nature to K-12 teachers, and of course I'm generalizing. So Joe is saying, we'll let Chris pick up what Joe's saying.
Yes. So, so lots of feedback to us that, you know, wow, I made these changes to my course once I went through, you know, and I learned and I applied the rubric to my course, even in teachers who are doing like a self-review, because we do offer like self-review tools, and so people can go back and, you know, evaluate their own course and strengthen it and continuously improve it. And so a lot of times we get feedback there where people are saying, wow, you know, I never realized, and you know, I taught this course and then I went through a QM review and then I made the changes and I taught the course again, and they are seeing their students really responding well to the changes that they made. One of the things that we're looking at when we do, we're looking at people who can really, you know, measure that, and so give us that feedback. And I don't know, Kay, if you can speak to that.
Thank you for raising that, pointing that out, Chris. We have that evidence. We have evidence in higher education of student performance improving as QM is implemented over time. We are just probably getting ready or getting to the point where in K-12, hopefully we will be able to have some studies. I mean, obviously it takes a little bit of time to see any efforts or any benefits. We started doing research or supporting very small grants of research in 2005, and even as early as 2005 we have evidence of studies in higher education. So we will continue to encourage that kind of study in K-12, and that might lead us to some recommendation, some of the recommendations. When you're doing your research or even exploring the research, build on research that's been done. There is some really good research that has been done. Of course, there's some poor research, and that gets the press. But there is some good research that has been done over the past decades. There is bodies of research that point out themes. We have on our website, and maybe if Barbara is still with us, Barbara could pop into the chat box some of the summaries of research and findings that we have in K-12, in Quality Matters. And again, most of it is higher education because Quality Matters has the longer history with in higher education. The other thing when you're building your research is keep your shareholders in mind. I mean, who are you really talking to? Who do you want this research to impact? We all have a lot of shareholders we have to keep in mind, including funders and district managers and taxpayers, community members, as well as students, colleagues, or building a research base. So keep your shareholders in mind, because that really will help you identify how you want to study. I'm looking at there's lots happening in the chat box, so maybe you can follow what Christine and Barbara are posting. The other recommendation that is pretty universal when it comes to looking at learning in an online or blended format, or even a face-to-face format, is start with learning, not with the technology. The technology is one piece, is the conduit, the delivery mode, and certainly has some impact on, if nothing else, the design. It looks like a link's not found, Barbara. I'm sure that'll be cleaned up. And then if you are interested in research, developing your question and methodology is crucial. As a matter of fact, because we tend to get a lot of questions from, well, sometimes it's folks working on their dissertation or just general. Developing your research question is extremely important. And so we developed a research toolkit. And let me see if we can copy down. Let me see if I can even link to it now. Oh, I might have luck. We have a, are you seeing, did my link work? If somebody can let me know. Well, I'm not sure if I actually linked into, it seems to be working. Okay, let me click on here that, in fact, we have developed a toolkit. If you are developing a question, doing research, you might want to follow through this toolkit. It seems to me, in my experience, in my roles, developing your research question is the toughest thing, the most essential thing, but it's tough. And so we have provided this as some tips. Tips you might want to run through it if you're really thinking of researching. One of the things that we didn't spend so much time on in the toolkit, and we will at some point, is the actual methodology section. My experience and my assumption from my experience is, within educational institutions, there are any number of people who can help you apply a methodology and to write up a final report. But all of that is secondary to the important part of developing question, which is why we went this direction. I am going to let Chris now talk about the rubric and the place of research in the rubric. Can I turn it over to you now, please, Chris?
I feel like I'm trying to do a million things here. Okay, so thank you, Kay. So the K-12 secondary rubric, this is our K-12 secondary rubric workbook. And as Kay mentioned, I think the link that she put into the chat that worked when you copy and paste, was that the link that is a link to the K-12 literature review, is that correct? Yeah, okay, so it was the K-12 Lit Review. That Lit Review, that actually stemmed from our latest revision of the Quality Matters K-12 Secondary Rubric. So our rubric is revised every 3 years, and as you know, I'm sure from Kay's talk earlier, so it's comprised of design standards for online and blended courses. So we revise it every 3 years, and we put together a group of practitioners from all over the country who can help us to do that. And in revising the rubric, we look at best practices and the latest research to support it. So we have research colleagues who Kay heads up, who scour what's out there and they match it to our standards. So when they do this, they help to support those research standards, and then that's compiled in our research library that you can access from our website. And so each of the standards is linked up to the research that will support it. And so the literature, so that Lit Review summary is there. Now remember, this was revised in 2013, and so the end of, well, starting next school year, we're going to be starting to put together our next group to revise the rubric. So we'll be gearing up to do that and scour the literature once more to see what's out there to support it. I'm throwing it back to you, Kay.
Hi, this is Kay. I got kicked out, so hopefully I'm back. I heard turning it over to you, Kay. Barbara has added the Quality Matters Research Library has about 600 citations that have been loaded by general standard. I'm assuming you're hearing me now. Okay, good. I'll keep going then. One of the things that the research colleagues and I are going to really be focusing on over the next 2 months is making sure that we have some uniform keywords so that when you go into the research library, you'll be better able to have selections revealed to you that are K-12. You can use that as a search criteria keyword right now. I can tell you you have to use K-12. K can be capitalized or not. But if you don't use the dash, you won't have studies revealed to you. So they're the kind of things that we're working on to make it friendlier to you as a potential user. We welcome submissions that we will review and include in the library if they fit. We ask that they are research oriented, have a methodology, if possible come from a peer-reviewed journal. But please submit those if you find a study that really informs your work as an educator. We have I have a list, just a few of the citations we talked about today. Let me check up with the chat. Joe is saying, considering the existing research in K-12 and the QM standards, what is one or two examples of areas that you wish you had more research on? That's a good question, Joe. There is so much research on interaction as a global topic, and that's the case in higher ed, and it's creeping into K-12. As I said, interaction is bubbling up as one of the themes. And you know, that makes sense, because we as educators / researchers want to study what's most near and dear to us. And so interaction as a big topic, a global topic, has a lot of information, a lot of studies. Some of it's conflicting, some of it's confusing, and I think the whole general topic of interaction in online learning helps us point out that when we look at research, we want to resist the temptation to overgeneralize and talk about the conditions under which the study was conducted. You know, sometimes studies are conducted, you want to make sure that the study you're highlighting wasn't done, or if it was done, you certainly want to say it. The interaction in this study was done with populations that were non-Western in their educational orientation, and they were in higher education. I mean, you have to be careful in generalizing, and I think that's what what we learned about in the interaction criteria. One of the things that is missing mostly from both K-12 and higher education is looking at the broader quality assurance issues, how these pieces fit together. You know, we would like to encourage people to continue working on that. There are a lot of segmentations. There's good information out there on assessments, as I said, interaction in media and technologies, and some really good stuff on learner support. But there's not much study, not enough study, let's say, on policies and procedures. So I'm not sure, Joe, if I answered your question, but I would think that there is a lot of existing K-12 research that highlights, even though it's, you know, it's not the body of research isn't as large as higher ed, but there's still a body there, and it is pointing to standards that inform the work of the committee that sets the standards. So I'm not sure if I answered your question. Are there any other questions? This is a quiet group. Chris, do you have anything to add while we wait for a question, or Barbara is typing? If not, oh, go ahead.
I feel a little bit out of the loop because I don't know what you already covered and what you didn't, so I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Well, I think that we would be happy to answer any questions. You can email us if the question pops in your head tonight. We love to answer emails. We really do. Sometimes it takes a little while. If you ask a specific question, I can dig up some research, or better yet, I point you to some research, point you to some references, and other resources. So thank you so much. We are passionate about the place of research in investigating and putting into practice and then studying those applications as ways to improve online learning for all of our students.
I'm going to jump in, Kay, and I'm just going to answer, I'm going to address Joe's, he asked if I could provide a quick overview of our two flagship PD courses for K-12, and so I'm going to go ahead and do that before we end. So we have a bunch of professional development courses. Most of them have to do with online course design, and so the two that Joe is talking about, our first one is applying the K-12 secondary rubric, and so that course is our flagship course. And what that course does is it helps educators to learn how to use the rubric and then to apply it to an actual teacher-developed online course. And so they learn the basic concepts of the rubric. They learn our concept of alignment, which means, you know, do the learning objectives, do they match up with the assessments? Do they match up with the instructional materials and the activities and the technology used within the course? And so they learn all about that. They learn about our 85% rule, which I kind of touched on in the chat. And so they learn, if they were looking at their course or another course, how can they actually apply a specific standard? So what is the lens that they need to look through? How can they put aside their personal preferences and you know, just go by the annotations in the rubric? And then they touch a little bit in that course on writing helpful recommendations. So part of what we do in that course is to teach people how they can write recommendations that are helpful, that are useful, that are measurable, and they're collegial, so that people can go back and make those changes to the course. So we teach them kind of like our equation of how to draw all of that into effective feedback. And then our second course that piggybacks off of that one is our K-12 reviewer course. And that's for people who want to take it a step further. So they want to learn how they can actually review an online course. They learn how to use our online course review management system. So they go in and they actually learn how to use that. And we take it a step further with writing recommendations. We go in and look at a course and we really you know, really dive deeper into, you know, what makes a good recommendation? How can you really look at the course and make sure that it meets standards? And then they actually use it and they do a mock review. It's good for people who are, you know, starting to do that in their districts, but not only that, people can then go on and they can become course reviewers for us, so that when someone does put a course through for a formal review, they can then go out, we can add them to our pool of reviewers. So we could say, hey, you're a subject matter expert in English 9, why don't you come and serve on our course review team? And so since we know they've gone through our professional development, they've had that background and that knowledge, and so then they can go on and become a K-12 course reviewer for us. They receive a little stipend for doing that, and they help us, and they help, you know, collectively online learning as a whole. And so we really appreciate, you know, everyone who does go through those courses and then does, you know, take it a step further and decides to become a course reviewer for us. So those are the two courses that Joe was talking about there. Any other questions? Thanks, Marianne, for catching that one about the rubric revision committee. Yeah, so we'll make that. We'll send that that call out, and we hope that a lot of you do decide to help us out with that effort. So, but thank you all so much for having us and for doing the good work that you do. We couldn't do this, we're all in this together.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Kay. I hope everyone enjoyed this fabulous presentation about learning more about Quality Matters' own program and how research impacts what they're doing there at QM. We did want to send a reminder about our upcoming webinar for this Friday, January 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be hearing from Randy Labonte and Verena Roberts from Can eLearn, the Canadian e-learning network, and they'll be sharing with us some leadership perspectives from Canada's online and blended learning programs. So again, feel free to join us there. We'll engage in a lively discussion. You can log in at connect.mivu.org/MVLRI, the same URL used for this webinar that you're currently attending. And in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to us. You can contact us via email at mvlri@mivu.org. On Facebook and Twitter, our handles are listed there. Our LinkedIn, YouTube, and webinars pages are also linked there as well. Our YouTube channel is where we will be posting the recorded version of the webinars that you've been attending. So we hope you can access those anytime you need to meet your own demands. Be sure to check out our webinars page, our last link there, to see the upcoming webinars that we have scheduled throughout the months of February and March. If there are any other questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat window or contact us using the contact information listed there. I hope everyone has a great Tuesday and enjoys the rest of your week. We look forward to seeing you Friday.